Tell me about After the Yellow Ribbon, how this came about, why the name, and what it means to start.
Um, well, I think it kind of began as this secondary thought. There was a small group that convened an anti-torture conference, and I was involved very early on in the planning and that. And I realized quickly I just couldn't do it while I was in school. And it just gave me this idea that these things can happen. And I wanted to bring to light some of the particular struggles of veterans, and in particular veterans who have seen combat, but not exclusively so, because of an experience I had coming to Duke Divinity School in the fall of 2010. I had come from my undergrad. I just finished, and I got into Duke. I came out here really enthusiastic. And during orientation, student orientation, there was a psychiatrist who was there as a part of CAPS, campus, I don't know what the A is, but basically the campus psychiatry service, counseling service. And he was talking about doctor-patient confidentiality. And he went on to say, you can tell us anything. You can tell us you kick your dog, you cheat on your spouse, you cheat on your tests, and he went on and on. He wrapped up by saying, you can even tell us that you've killed someone. At which point, the entire entering class, my own cohort, burst out laughing. And I can't blame them. I mean, he was kind of making it light, and he was trying to kind of enrich his presentation. But from where I was sitting, it wasn't something I could laugh at. In fact, after having spent 14 months in Iraq in 2004, and knowing that that was the very thing that I would go see the counseling service for, it felt very clearly, it was this moment of estrangement where I have certain experiences that weigh heavily on me, and to see my classmates not understand the significance of that really set me back. It took me a number of weeks before I really felt like I could get into classes. And out of that experience, I learned, and I think this is to the credit of the divinity community at Duke, that response was not born out of lack of care. It was a lack of understanding that significance that a lot of veterans, student veterans, are bringing particularly to academies, and they're bringing into churches that they attend. And so I thought that having a conference to just begin conversations, and there's certainly places in which those conversations have already begun occurring. They're often kind of difficult to find. And I think that the wider community at Duke sits in a very unique position. It's in North Carolina, which is a state that has 1 in every 10 residents are veterans. It has a major military installation at Fort Bragg, and Duke University is a major research institution. And so these spheres of military, academy, and church, the church being the div community for me at Duke, and being one of the top-ranked divinity schools in the world, I thought that intersection was too important to pass up, and so that's kind of where it came from.
What are you hearing so far from veterans?
Well, I've placed myself in a position to mostly be able to hear people who are speaking from a theological perspective. So for a number of years, and I still am a member in Iraq Veterans Against the War, my vocation, my identity, my history is more concretely in the location of the church than it is, some political, identity. And so a lot of the soldiers I speak to and are in touch with struggle particularly with, what do I do as a Christian? And there's also a number of questions that surround, what do I do as a human being who has had to think and consider killing another human being?
How do you deal with that?
Me personally?
You personally, or some of the vets you've spoken with?
I think it comes in a variety of ways. So I became a Christian in 2006 in the midst of learning that I also had post-traumatic stress disorder. I just come back from my 14 months in Iraq, and I think the first time I actually knew that I had something like post-traumatic stress was the second day we were in Iraq. We were convoying up, and we hit an IED, and nobody was hurt, but that evening I had my first nightmare. And coming home, I would have night sweats. It would be difficult for me to stay asleep. Hypervigilance was a big part of it. I remember on the bus from Hickam Airfield on Oahu, we passed a car pulled over on the side of the freeway, and I noticed myself instinctively scooting away from the window, and I thought to myself immediately, like, that must be something like PTSD. And so one of the things that's been really helpful for me before I kind of fell into the church was music. I was on Oahu and I was surfing a lot, so I was in the water, which is always really important to me. But I was listening to like Jack Johnson, Matt Costa, Eddie Vedder, and then as I became a Christian, I think I began listening to bands that could speak more specifically to that, like Derek Webb, Caedmon's Call, Thrice, Orange County Supertones, and it's just one of the particularities of my story. I really like music. In fact, we've got Derek Webb coming to do a Q&A after the Yellow Ribbon, as well as do the benefit concert in the evening. So that's what it's been for me, but it's different for each individual.
And Alan will get you just sure. When you have related your story to others of dealing with the tensions of war, mm-hmm. dealing with the tensions that you may be talking with veterans who, in the rules of engagement of war, killed other human beings, and they are now coming to grips with this, struggling with this. Is there a central message of listening that you give these people?
Yeah, I think that's the first thing that we can do. The first thing that we can do is be prepared to receive the stories that they carry. And so many times it's just simply having to be heard that I think a lot of veterans I've been in touch with express.
Did it change you when you were heard?
When I was heard. Yeah, I think so. I think I made myself heard. I began blogging, and then I made this curious decision to write a book about my journey out of the military. But I'm also surrounded by a circle of friends who were able to hear the stories I had to share. And they also were very ingrained in the church and educated and formed in the practices that constitute the church, like confession, like repentance, reconciliation. And so I think that's why, for me, my identity is so much more wrapped up in what it means to be a Christian soldier, as opposed to merely just what does it mean to be a human being who's trying to serve a nation state that's asking me to do things that deeply conflict with what I believe or what I know.
Is killing justified in war?
I don't think it is. I thought a lot about that when I was in Iraq, actually. And what got me about the question of justifiability is that it's, you never have time for it. One of my platoon mates, we were on a convoy, which are always very high stress because of IEDs. You're going 50, 60 miles an hour in a Humvee that shouldn't be going more than 45 miles an hour, usually at night with night vision goggles on that you can see about that much of the road. And he expressed to me that they weren't taking fire or anything, just some kid in the middle of the night walked into the road. And he literally didn't have time to swerve out of the way, and he hit him. He didn't think he killed him. But that was an act that occurred in war, and yet it had nothing to do with what we associate with war. And so I think part of the question is, war encompasses so much, particularly contemporary warfare, where we have failed in large part to protect non-combatants. I mean, the number of civilians who have died in combat have gone up exponentially since World War II and slightly before. And so our understanding of war is very different from some of the church fathers and early political thinkers who understood war as very different, often hand-to-hand combat. And so that's a different question as to, well, a woman that I saw had a grenade in her hand, I had to shoot her. And now I have to figure, was it a grenade, was it something else? Maybe it was, but I still can't wrestle with it. So I think the question is diluted to an extent that without people having experience, it's difficult to put words to how complex and chaotic war is.
We do tend to want to make things pretty black and white, don't we, Alan?
We do, and it's much more complex than that. When you ask about is killing justified, it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of somebody like Logan or other soldiers. But from a Christian perspective, I'm not sure we can ever justify killing in the midst of a war.
Yet we find ourselves in nationalism sometimes. Those who are believers, those who are Christians, all caught up in flag waving
Yes.
and saying, let's just go kick their asses,
Yeah.
and meaning it.
Sure. Sure.
How do you justify that?
It's very easy to fall into that that sort of temptation to retaliate, especially in a world that was changed so significantly by an event like September 11th. But the Christian tradition simply is non-retaliation, and no matter how justified that killing might seem in the moment, in the heat of the moment, it will never undo the evil that was done. And that is not to excuse the evil of an act of September 11th. That's not to excuse the evil of an authoritarian regime or a dictator who might be doing horrible things. But it is not a call to kill to resolve those awful issues.
Yeah, I want to get back to the conference in just a moment. But people are going to watch this. People who live in this area, particularly who serve in the military or are veterans. I'm not saying all, but many, I think, many it's fair to say, and are going to say, you guys are wrong.
Sure.
Almost to say you guys are traitors. How can you say this? And traitor's not the right word. That's too strong from my standpoint. But for someone who believes so differently, how do you respond to that?
Simply to say, I'm a veteran too. I served.
Where did you serve?
I served in the United States Army in the mid-1980s in Germany. And my experience was not in an active shooting war, but under the stress of 18 months where we could be at war at any moment, at a frontline unit that would be assigned to the East German border to roll up, and that changes you. And so to see the fallacy of this, yes, we need national defense. We need to protect ourselves. And some will make that argument to say, well, war is justified for that reason. But what I think we're calling attention to is the effects that that has on those who do the defense. And when I came home in 1987, there was no one to talk to. It was a non-shooting war, but some of the significant mental and health impact was the same as what Logan's experienced, going through several years of treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and trying dreams about possibility of dying. And when you're 18, 19, 20 years old, these things are formative. And I don't know that we understand that. And given the fact that our society is so removed from the military now, so few people serve, so few people have someone they know who served, their grandparents maybe in World War II, is some distant memory. I don't think we acknowledge the impact that these things have.
We have so many people serving them. It's all volunteer. And if people are on their third, fourth, fifth, maybe even more deployments, either to Iraq or Afghanistan. We have a crew in Afghanistan just on their way home tomorrow. Are those with multiple deployments, do you think, more prone to have issues, struggling issues once they return?
I think it's mixed. It'd be hard to find hard data that would refute it, but it also seems as though it's anecdotal. The more often you go, the more likely it is that you're going to experience the kind of effects that would lead to something like moral fragmentation or post-traumatic stress. But that should not imply that with one deployment, or a Marine, which is a 6-month deployment, is not just as likely to have experienced the same kind of effects that someone who's gone repeatedly. I do, however, think that the more frequently and the more accumulated total time you have in combat, I think you're just more and more likely to have the kind of experiences that lead to the kind of moral fragmentation that that PTSD, I think, points to.
So here's where I was going next. Outside, or in addition to a safe space at this conference and a place to be listened to, what else might a person find there?
In a safe space?
Or, if a person chooses to come to this conference, what will be waiting for them?
Oh man, I hope. One thing that we've been able to do is we've been able to get people across the ideological divide. We've got an ethicist from West Point giving a keynote and also breakout session. I wanted to comment just briefly about the nationalism piece, because I think that objection comes from a sense of something like camaraderie. Americans have this unique history that binds us together in a certain way. The problem comes in, I think, is when we fear that dissent can lead to the dissolution of all that we know and love. But I think our country, besides being formed on a kind of dissent and a kind of a hopeful expectation of the commonality of man, I think the other thing that I think should be articulated is that what just war is and justifying war does is it attempts to provide a kind of formation and a kind of framework around which, when someone experiences something like having to shoot a non-combatant who may be, or having to shoot someone in war who may or may not be armed, it tries to provide the moral framework around which they can cling when that digestion comes later. So the right answer is not to say that war can never be justified, but I think the right answer is to say that just war is an ambitious attempt to prevent things like PTSD before they form. But the problem, I think, when we rely too much on our ideologies and too much on our own doctrines. I mean, just war is a concrete doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church and a number of different Christian traditions. But when we don't take it seriously enough to the point where we're actually able to live it out and be able to say this war is just, which Afghanistan by and large was declared just by a number of traditions, the Iraq War wasn't. And so what do we do as a religious body when we've said something, but then it comes time to make concrete movements to actually abide by that finding? So what I'm really saying is that, for example, in Iraq, if someone is really committed to just war, and, for example, the Roman Catholic Church declared it unjust, how do we provide the space for them to respond in faith to the dictates of their conscience? And we haven't done that. Right now, the military is either universal objection or universal pacifism. And I think that further divides us in ways that we really don't need to be divided. I think the vast majority of people are rational, reasonable adults that want to do good, but also need to know that when they are faced with being asked to do bad, they can back away and say, I have to obey my conscience. Or in the Christian tradition, we've said that we have to obey God rather than man in Acts 5:29. But I think that the nationalism piece comes from a deep sense of wanting to be a part of a larger community. And I think that's good. Like, I don't want everybody to throw their convictions aside and forget about them, but I want the...
Does it also come out of fear?
It does. But I mean, pacifists are certainly afraid too. We don't want our children suffering for our beliefs much more than we want other children suffering for their beliefs. But it's that willingness to face our own convictions and say, this is what I believe, and this is what I'll stand by. But when we either don't allow ourselves or when we don't allow others to abide by those convictions, that's when things like moral fragmentation really occur. And that's when I've been asked to do something that I find wrong, or that my religious or moral community tells me is wrong, and I do it anyway. And then I have to suffer the consequences and go through whatever practice it is that my community has dictated I'm supposed to go through.
Do you have regrets that you served in the military?
No, I wouldn't be the man I am today if I didn't.
Alan?
It's a complicated question. I regret some of the things I did there. I don't regret the service. I'm proud to have served the country. I believe I serve it now in my pastoral role. And so I am thankful for the service, but I do regret some of the experiences and because of how they shaped me and what they did to my own moral framework.
Is that what brings you to where you are today, to be a part of this conference?
Absolutely. I think when you ask what do we hope to come out of this, I think building on that dialogue. When I got out of the military, there was no dialogue. There was no space to talk about some of the things that were seen and done, and that was a very lonely space. And going into college at that time, and as an undergraduate, no one there had the same experience. And the only military people at the college I went to were the ROTC. And so they saw it from a very different perspective, not actually having served. So it does bring me there today, but to have that dialogue, provide a safe space, if you will, to talk about these issues. It's not necessarily to convert people to pacifism. I mean, certainly as a pastor, that is my position, but it is to have the dialogue and to acknowledge that these things do have an impact.
It's November 11th and 12th. It'll be held at the Divinity School. Where are the schools?
Most of it will be in Goodson Chapel. The new chapel I think finished in 2005.
Yeah.
It's actually just outside the chapel entranceway. There's actually our war memorial, which was commissioned, I think, in 2004, 2003, maybe a little bit later. And not a whole lot of people know that between the two chapels, between Goodson and Duke, we actually have a war memorial that hold the name of the people who served and paid the ultimate price in defense of their country. I think that's indicative of something. I think that something about war is so close to our heart, and yet we often will try and push it away. And that's the danger we run into when we don't allow the dialogue to occur. We either are afraid of its outcome or we're too bought into trying to convince people, when I think we really just need to trust in individuals and their consciences to make decisions that are going to, that they can live with the rest of their lives.
And one thing that I have learned in talking with pacifists over the years is that you are not anti-troops. You are not anti-people who have chosen to serve.
No.
Your focus is on the outcome of military engagement.
Right.
Not the people who choose to be a part
right.
of the service.
That's really the origin of the name After the Yellow Ribbon was that kind of knee-jerk reaction of, we want to support our troops, so we'll buy this $1.50 magnet, put it on our car, and that'll solve my moral misgivings as a civilian. We're trying to say, after that, that's not bad. Not everybody agrees with what the yellow ribbon signifies, but we're trying to say, after that occurs, then what do we do? After the troops are coming home, after troops have left, after they've left their families, what do we do after those momentary indications of patriotism? What is really supporting the troops look like?
And that's also very patriotic.
Yeah, we think it is.
Absolutely. We're going to face years and years of cost and support for people who've come back with physical and mental injuries. And we're just becoming knowledgeable about what some of that looks like. Nothing could be more patriotic than supporting people who served and were harmed and deserve the country's support. And we have an obligation not to just make it an empty veneration of veterans, but to support them and their families for the long haul, because it's going to be a long haul.
My thanks to both of you.